For all you professional brewers out there, I'm here to tell you that planning brew schedules is easier than ever with Imperial Yeast, who guarantee that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 4 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. A killer deal from an incredible company. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it is time to up your game. Check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Yeast health is often discussed as being one of the most important components to making a quality batch of beer, and there are a number of things that can impact how well yeast performs during fermentation. Now, these days, it's very common for brewers to reuse yeast that previously fermented a batch of beer, though there are some purportedly important considerations one should make when doing this, one of which regards the size of the beer the yeast is harvested from. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schutt, and joining me to talk about reusing yeast that was previously used to ferment a high OG ale is our newest contributor, Andy Carter. Welcome to the crew, Andy.
Hey, thanks, Marshall. Been a longtime fan. I'm really happy to join you guys and help out.
Well, I've been a longtime fan of yours as well. Andy, you've been plugged into the home brewing scene for quite some time, right?
Yeah, so I started brewing about 10 years ago, and once you have your first beer and you say, well, how do I make this? You're off to the races. So been doing that. Been at my local homebrew club, the Ventura Independent Beer Enthusiasts, and in the last few years, I've been helping out run the Southern California Homebrewers Festival. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, we're super excited to have you on board. You're going to be contributing to the experiments and all of that stuff, just like all the other contributors, as well as this podcast. And on this specific episode, we're talking about something fairly specific, harvesting yeast from a beer that is of high OG. So this has been commonly recommended not to do. We're going to be digging into that, as well as the results of an experiment that I performed on this subject in just a bit. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Just last week, Jay Goodwin from the Rare Barrel answered questions for an hour. It was amazing, and I'm so excited for our April guest, Kevin Davey from Portland's Wayfinder Beer. I love lager styles, and I'm telling you right now, Wayfinder might be one of the best, top 3 lager breweries in America. Kevin's going to be taking questions on April 25th, 2020, so be sure to make your pledge before that to get in on the action. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you want. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would really appreciate that. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Adam Otwine from Texas had some feedback on our recent Kveik fermentation temperature episode. Why in the hell does everybody think Kveik should be fermented around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 38 degrees C? Like lager yeast fermenting cold can and should seem misaligned. As I understand it, these yeasts are amazing in climates, houses, wherever temperature is higher than you'd like, but it seems like the norm is to heat the fermenter to these temps because the chatter has led people to believe that that's what you're supposed to do with them. Just imagining that fermenting 30 degrees warmer than you should ever even store a beer is bad news for flavor stability, even if the yeast can do it.
Yeah, so I think there's, I have yet to play with it. I've had quite a few Kveik beers. I think that it's a new thing. Obviously, we're figuring it out together. That's a commercial side. Kveik, or Norwegian yeast, has been around for ages.
Yeah,
it's dried, it's staved on sticks, and there's interesting looking rings you can see on the internet now of storing it. Everything I've read so far, it likes to be hot. But I think we just need to keep going and trying other temperatures and seeing. I think it's new.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, right?
Yeah, so I get what Adam's saying. I actually really appreciate the sentiment. I think he's being a little bit funny here, but this whole idea, I mean, that's sort of like brewlosophy's bread and butter is questioning the should, and just, basically what he's saying is just because you can do this doesn't mean you have to, which is exactly my mentality when it comes to fermenting lager beers.
It kind of reminds me of, a few years ago, you probably remember this, Marsh. People swore that the DuPont Saison strain has to be done at 90 plus degrees or you will never finish the beer out.
Right,
and
exactly.
How many times have we seen that not be the case?
Many
times. Yeah, a lot, right? So there's a lot of other things going on here, and I think we're going to all settle in on what it means and what temperatures mean. And, hey, if you come from a school of temperature control and stable fermentation, hearing this, your alarm bells are going off.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. So.
Yeah. Well, and I've had Kvike fermented beers that were fermented at normal, ale temperatures and not super warm. And we've done an experiment on this as well. I do think it creates a different characteristic. So if the warmer temperature is what is creating the characteristic that you like, then by all means ferment it warm. To say that you have to use this yeast at 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38°C, yeah, I do think it's a little bit weird. Can and should, misaligned, whatever. I do agree with what Adam is saying on some level here, though. At the same time, do what you want. I mean, what I love about Kvike is that if you don't have the ability to control your fermentation temperatures, it does seem like there's this family of yeasts out there now that you can just pitch it and leave it in your garage in the middle of summer and you're probably going to be okay. So for that, I appreciate what Kvike is doing to the brewing world. So
absolutely,
yeah,
a lot more things to look at.
Exactly. Well, thanks for the feedback, Adam. Like I said, I'm kind of with you there and sort of wonder the same thing myself. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. All right, a few episodes back, the boys reviewed an unflavored hard sparkling water that was made by none other than this show's newest co-host, Andy Carter.
Yes.
Now, as I understand it, that unflavored version really was just served sort of like as a baseline for you to experiment with other stuff, right?
Yeah. So like a little rundown. Everyone has heard about the claws and how few laws they have. I make mead. I've yet to make a grape wine, but I make a lot of beer and I like making mead. And mead, unlike beer, has very little nutrient profile. So the best way to ferment that is with a set of nutrients. It's called the staggered nutrient addition method. When I heard about cider making or seltzer making, it's just dextrose or corn sugar or cane sugar. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just use the same exact process of staggered nutrient additions to execute that. And I didn't have a flavor in mind, so I said, let's just go plain and see where we end up.
What's funny to me is that the guys seem to like that unflavored one quite a bit. They said it tasted like champagne, which I don't understand. But you also sent me one that you did add some flavoring to, and I served that to the guys for review as well.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. I will always love you.
That's a cloudy beer.
I will never leave you alone, Timmy.
Ooh, this smells like country time lemonade.
Yeah, it does. What if it is? What if it is and we for once stick it? Oh, God, it hit me like a brick.
It is not country time lemonade.
Like someone threw a brick at my face. But it's good.
It's not so much.
You're not so much. What if you're not as good as you think you are? I love you, buddy.
It's like Alka-Seltzer.
Oh, wow.
This is Tylenol cold and flu, but a little better.
We've done this before. We've had this before. We know what this is. I like it.
It could be some lemonade that got watered down with dishwater a little bit.
So
I don't like it.
Let's go to the bar and try to describe to the bartender that this is what we want.
If he rang out the dish rag, it is not good.
I like it.
Actually, this is better than anything I could make. This is not what I would drink.
Does this have ginger in it?
Yeah.
I think this has ginger in it.
It could.
So this is a ginger something. I like this.
Oh, good.
I think it's like a ginger cider or something. It can't be a beer.
It's a little seltzery.
This tastes like the long drink that they do in like the Scandinavian Peninsula. It's called long drink. It's like a Smirnoff Ice. So this is a ginger Smirnoff Ice.
There we go. -2 for me.
I'll give it -1 for a total of 4.
So with that review, I always love those guys when they come at you from left field. So what we added there was the base finished seltzer or sparkling water. But there's a company called Amaretti, and they make flavor ingredients, all shapes and sizes. They're actually not too far away from my house. They also make something called a craft puree product, and they have a Moscow Mule flavor. And this really piqued my interest because I kind of like that flavor, the ginger, the spice, and everything. So I just added a little bit of that to the bottle, and off we go.
Well, the guys nailed it with the ginger then. I mean, I thought that was pretty good. I couldn't believe whoever, I think it was Jersey who said ginger. I couldn't believe he actually nailed that one. It did kind of have a country time lemonade flavor as well. Those guys picked something up and I was like, yeah, God, I'm getting that as well. But overall, very interesting. Now I've had, so the amaretti stuff that you added is an actual like fruit-based product, right?
Correct. So it's called craft puree, and it's essentially a ready mixed, ready to go. It comes in bottles. They have pump bottles as well.
Right. So the only other like home brewed version of a flavored sparkling water that I've had, a local buddy here made one, and he added a grapefruit extract that he got at More Beer. And I don't know how much he used, but it wasn't like a real fruit thing. And it tasted like, a grapefruit LaCroix, basically. So there are other options. I think it's kind of exciting that we've got something new to play around with it that, I know that it kind of incites a little bit of hate, but at the same time, it's something new. It's kind of fun and they're kind of easy to drink. So, well, Andy, I appreciate you being brave enough to send these in for the guys to review. I mean, now you know how it feels, right? Because I'm doing this all the time with my stuff.
Yeah. Hey, anytime. It's always a new experience. Maybe I'll find some mead. We can do mead next.
There we go. There we go. All right. Well, if you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Brewing isn't necessarily the most affordable hobby out there, as I imagine any brewer's partner will attest. It's because that we've come up with some really clever ways to reduce the price of a batch. And seeing as yeast is easily the most expensive ingredient in beer, that's the focus of a lot of these cost-cutting methods. Now, we've talked before about harvesting yeast from starters, but another very popular approach involves repitching yeast that was previously used to ferment another batch of beer.
So what happens during beer fermentation, I think we should just go over that for everyone at home. Beer, when you pitch it, the yeast or Saccharomyces starts off as a culture from a lab. And this company, or whoever you get it from, Imperial Yeast or Fermentis or Y Yeast or White Labs, is a controlled amount of yeast, and it was grown to its optimal conditions. When you add it to beer, a few steps happen. We're going to start with a lag phase, or when the yeast take up oxygen that's dissolved into the beer, they make something called sterols, which we'll get into in a second. And then it starts just consuming all that oxygen, and it's called the aerobic phase of fermentation. this is important because this is when the cell walls of the yeast, they're squishy. They're not hard. They're not rigid. They need to be reinforced because they're going to start budding in a minute.
Right.
This budding process is when you're going to make more cells. The sterols, like I mentioned, are from the grain. They're derived from the grain and the sugars, and they make up the cell's wall membrane. There's two functions here. The cell wall is permeable, so it needs to reinforce itself and be strong. But the sterols also make it more tolerant to the alcohol that's just about to be made. Now, after the aerobic phase consumed all the oxygen, the anaerobic phase, the phase that we care about, it's going to take those sugars and create CO2, alcohol, and flavor compounds. This is when also a lot of the budding or asexual reproduction of the yeast is going to occur.
And that is when we're talking about the yeast growth or propagation of yeast, that's when this is that's basically the phase wherein this is happening, right?
Yeah, correct. And I was looking online to get some more details. I think, many homebrewers that have done this for a little while have a sense of what fermentation is and the process, but there's just a good line from the Yeast website. The extent and rate of yeast growth is directly related to the production of aroma and flavor compounds. So what does this mean? We talk about pitch rate, and we'll get into suggested pitch rates in a little bit. But pitching the right rate is how you're going to get the right flavor in the beer you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge focus in brewing in general, not just home brewing, but professional brewers, of course, probably more so than us. But pitch rate and making sure that you pitch the proper amount, and that's why we make starters. It's one of the things that I think a lot of us love about Imperial Yeast is that they are sending you a pouch of yeast that has pretty solid pitch rate. Their pitch right pouch, so you can pitch right from the pouch and not have to worry about making a starter for many of the batches of beer that we make. But the whole idea, again, being that you want the healthiest yeast possible to go in and put up a good fight in that sugary wort.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good point to talk about. What is the pros and cons of reusing yeast? Because hey, I just made a beer. I spent $8 or $9. I want to make a beer like that again.
Exactly.
How do I maximize my value of that?
Yeah.
So I think let's just go quickly through pros and cons of yeast reuse. That's a tongue twister. So time, money, and freshness. So what's time? I don't have to go to the store or I have to wait for a shipment. I'm getting my yeast today. Money, like we said, we're not going to buy more yeast yesterday. And freshness. In general, a healthy fermentation with the right oxygen, those sterols are produced, the nutrient content is going to leave you with 90+% viable yeast. Mm-hmm. We'll get into viable in a little bit. What are the cons? You can only make so many styles. Upwards of 70% of the flavor out of a beer is coming from the yeast, even if it's a neutral ale strain. So if you like only making a few different styles, then that might be your go-to.
Yeah.
And then, I think as you learn, or at least as you taught homebrewing, there's always a risk of contamination. So if you're going to go reuse yeast, you better be on top of your sanitization practices.
Absolutely. That's my biggest fear. When to kind of hit on those three things that you're talking about, the freshness component is amazing because you are literally making the yeast that you're going to pitch. So exactly when it was done. Your hands were on it. This is what I was talking about in a previous episode. You are more intimately involved with this yeast that's going to go do your work for you. The saving money component was back in the day when I first realized that I could prop up yeast and split it off myself. Being able to save, $7 to $11 per batch. I mean, that was literally a third of the price.
Yeah.
Right. And that's huge. But that sanitization point, boy, I have borrowed somebody's yeast before. Yeah, I know, man. Risky move there. And, they maybe just one little misstep. And if you're not careful enough, you can really ruin a batch of yeast. And I say that because if you're going to keep propagating it and reusing that same pitch, it's just going to get worse and worse. So that's a definite thing to be mindful of.
Yeah, I think the last thing I want to go on, I don't know if it's a pro or a con. I think it's something you need to understand. When we're fermenting and you're doing reuse, the yeast generationally will change. And what does this mean? Every time you reuse it, you're taking yeast from a specific part of the fermentation. It's either stuff at the bottom of the fermenter or kind of near the end. And those yeasts are going to be different than the first time you got them from Imperial or any other yeast company. And we call this selective pressure. Mm-hmm. This is different from natural selection where just nature takes its course with the yeast. So what does this mean for you? If you're reusing your yeast, you probably will notice over time its flavor will change, its flocculation will change. It might change how aggressively it ferments. And if you like that, great. This is what some people call house culture.
Right.
And so, there are tons of breweries out there that have made their name for themselves based on house culture. You just need to be aware of that and understand it. Maybe you only go 5 generations before you get a new pitch. Maybe you'll go 10 generations. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, another, that was an issue. Again, when I started doing harvesting from starters, we're going to talk about different methods for harvesting yeast here in a sec. But when I started harvesting from starters, that was something that I was very concerned with because, if I wanted to make tiny bottom pale ale and I had a pitch that I'd already harvested and repropagated, 6 or 7 times, would I be making the same beer? And I did some research, and what I found is that there are certain strains that are so hardy and so, they're just so pure, I guess, and that you can reharvest over and over and over, and they seem not to drift too much. And then there are other strains, and I've heard that Saison is one of these, that, you could go 4 or 5 generations out, and if you were to start with that initial pitch and compare it to that 5th or 6th generation pitch, they would just be vastly different, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I have some commercial brewery friends. When they started learning how to do, this is a few years ago, starting to get into hazy IPA territory, they got a lot of warnings, like be careful where you pitch from in terms of your cone, because, a few generations out, you are maybe not have any haze, maybe bright beer. So that's, a big thing to think about.
Yeah. Well, we could go down this rabbit hole, but that whole idea of I like the yeast that falls out first, obviously is going to be, ostensibly is going to be the most flocculent, right? The quickest to drop out. So if you're pulling from the bottom of that cone, you are presumably getting a yeast that wants to get out of the way, right? And so it would be so interesting to take yeast from the bottom of a cone and compare it to yeast from the top of a cone, like in a commercial brewery, and do two batches. I'd just be fascinated to see how that turned out. Okay, so in terms of harvesting, we've talked a little bit about harvesting from starters, but probably the easiest way that people are doing reusing yeast is just taking some yeast from the trub after one batch is fermented and pitching it into the next beer. I've done this a lot. I've done a bunch of experiments on this. It does seem to be a very viable method and it works, it works really, really well. The big thing with this one, in my opinion, again, sanitization. There are so many vectors for potential contamination when using this method. If you make sure that you are. I always would boil my mason jars if I was collecting them in a mason jar.
For sure.
You want to basically sterilize everything, and then I'm scooping it out, I'm closing it as tight as I can, and then I'm rinsing it in a Star San solution just to make sure there's no hopefully there's no bugs in there.
Yeah, I mean, if your mason jars, I think are one of God's gifts to the brewing industry. These things are, you can boil them, you don't microwave the tops. I don't recommend that.
Yeah.
But clean them good, and they'll take care of you.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing with harvesting from a batch of beer, taking the yeast slurry from the batch of a already fermented beer, is you have absolutely, like you said, like 95% viability. Yeah. All of those cells are rip roaring, ready to go. They want to make beer. They're ready to make that beer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing I want to jump in on reusing yeast, this definitely comes up if you read articles about reusing yeast, is something called rinsing. And I think there's kind of in my head, there's 2 things there with rinsing. So one is you have yeast, but we know there's trub. We know there's hop particulate at the bottom of your fermenter, just the nature of the beer going in. And one way of thinking about rinsing is just removing the solids. And there's some good videos online. The name escapes me right now, but adding clean, sterile water to your fermenter and letting it and shaking up that bottom stuff and letting it separate back out, and then only taking out the yeast, letting all the hop particles fall to the bottom. Again, sanitization. Yeah. If you're clean, this is a good thing to do. You don't want to store things that aren't going to ferment your beer, like the hops. Something you also might find, and I'll just say what it is, and then we can talk about it, is something called acid washing. Mm-hmm. Ironically, acid washing your beer yeast will kill bacteria, and this means you're actually lowering the pH of the solution to 2 to 2.4 cold and doing it for 30 to 60 minutes. I got this from the beer. There's 2 books I've been referencing for this. There's a Michael Lewis book on brewing, and then there's the Chris White yeast book. Mm-hmm. If you want to dig much deeper into this, get that Chris White yeast book. I think it's a great modern example of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah. So the thing here is, so you acid wash, you're killing bacteria. I see 2 issues here. One is, this is a fairly advanced topic. I don't recommend looking at this until you feel good and comfortable with all the other parts of brewing. And is it necessary? If you're clean at home, what's the bacteria content really going to be? This is for professional brewers that really want to save. They do not want to risk anything.
Yeah.
And the book gets into this. Not every yeast strain wants this to happen to itself. So you have to really know your yeast well to do the acid wash. I don't think that in my 10 years, there was a reason to ever do this.
No.
Because it's not that much money.
Yeah. Also, on our scale, I mean, for what we're doing, again, it's not much money just to repitch straight from, if you don't want to risk, pitching straight from the bottom of your fermenter, then just go buy another pouch of yeast or whatever. It's not a big deal. Now I've done the yeast rinsing thing a few times. That's actually how I started off harvesting yeast, because that's all I read about on the internet. It's cool. It works. You can get really clean, nice, creamy layers of yeast. You're not going to get as much using that method as if you just pull a big slug of yeast from the bottom of your fermentation vessel. But it does work. I would recommend, if you are going that route, to make sure to prop up that yeast in a starter. And I always presume that there's about 100 billion cells when I do the yeast rinsing thing. Now, if I'm just pulling a slug from the bottom of the firm vessel, there's got to be, 600 billion cells maybe. I mean, there's so much yeast.
Actually, so I looked at before some of the explosion of more internet availability of brewing references, Mr. Malty, aka Jamil Zainashev of home brewing, I would say infamy or fame, and now the owner of Heretic Brewing. He had a nice line about let's estimate what is at the bottom of a fermenter. There is about 4.5 billion yeast cells in 1 milliliter of yeast solids with no excess liquid. And according to Fix, this is George Fix, a professor of brewing, in a slurry, only about 25% of that mass is yeast solids. Of course, if there's a lot of trub in there, you'll have an even lower percentage. So if you take that 4.5 billion in a cell of yeast solids and then calculate it all down, you can get a good estimate for what you should have. Of course, the only way to be totally sure is a cell count with a microscope.
Yeah, for sure. Now, when it comes to reusing yeast that you've already fermented a beer with, there are some recommendations. One of which we kind of hit on a little bit. If you are if you're making an IPA or a dry hopped pale ale and you're not filtering out the hops, your dry hop addition, you're going to have some hops in that yeast. Does that impact the flavor of the subsequent beer that you make? That would be a great experiment that we could mess around with. But people would suggest, maybe you want to pitch a new, a new yeast. You don't want to, add all of that hop matter, that trub. I know you say trub, but you don't want to add all of that to your next beer, particularly if, let's say, you made an IPA. There's a bunch of hops in that slurry, and then you're making something like a blonde ale. Is the chances of you imparting flavor that you weren't intending to be there are going to be a bit higher naturally.
Absolutely. You only want yeast as much as possible. There's always going to be some transfer, but just try only getting yeast is the goal here.
Yeah. Now, the other, and the focus of this show, the other big recommendation when it comes to reusing yeast from a batch that's you've already used to ferment a beer is that you don't ever want to pitch from a higher OG beer to a lower OG beer. And there are plenty of reasons for this. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when a yeast is fermenting a big beer. We're talking up north of like 1070 OG. Yeah.
If old brewing knowledge was 1060, or that's the Rubicon of is it a higher gravity beer?
Yeah.
So if we talked earlier in the show, we talked about the yeast life cycle. It's a lag phase, exponential growth, and then there's some stationary stuff. Let's think about a yeast cell, and I think it helps to anthropomorphize the yeast a little bit, but we don't want to do too much. The yeast is a single-celled microorganism. It buds to make new cells, but it's a semi-permeable lipid membrane. And the big thing that goes on in all fermentations, and especially in high-gravity fermentations, is the osmotic pressure on this yeast is increasing.
Right.
The osmotic pressure is a measurement of what's outside the yeast cell and what's inside the yeast cell. When you add yeast to beer or wort, now it's become beer that you've added yeast, in any gravity beer, there is a lot more sugar outside the cell than inside the cell. And just due to thermodynamics, there's going to put pressure on the cell wall. And that is where what we'll call stress is going to occur for this for the yeast cell. So I did some more, digging in, and I found some academic papers on the subject, and it's pretty interesting. I think I'm just going to briefly summarize 2 results I found. So there's one paper. It's called "The Effects of Osmotic Pressure and Ethanol on Yeast Viability." It's by Patricia Pratt, and it's from the Journal of Institute of Brewing. And what they did was they took both an ale yeast and a lager yeast, and they exposed fixed amounts of those yeasts to 10% ABV immediately. So it's just fresh yeast, vital and viable yeast, and then and exposed to this, and then every few hours took some cells out, and then it did a viability test. And what they found was both the ale and lager decreased in viability over time, but the lager yeast really crashed. It within a few days went down to 80% viable by sitting in this. Interestingly enough, the ale yeast survived the more than 90% the entire time in it. So alcohol content is going to affect the yeast's ability to survive over time.
That's fascinating that these two different species of Saccharomyces reacted or responded differently to these different to the same environment. I mean, that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. And so then another paper I found, I think this is more important for the fermentation side. That's just alcohol. We're trying to, with these experiments, they're trying to minimize conflicting variables.
Yeah.
That's just what alcohol is doing now. Found another paper. This is by a gentleman named, a person named G.P. Casey. Journal of American Society of Brewing Chemists. This was called High Gravity Brewing: Influence of Pitching Rate and Wort Gravity on Early Yeast Viability. And so they made a series of worts ranging from 11.8 Plato to 38.4 Plato, and within the first 12 hours of fermentation, monitored viable cell count. And if you look at this graph, and I think it's very fascinating, the 11.8 Plato wort started at 7. The viable cell count started at 7 millions of colony-forming units per milliliter, but it got up to 10 within 12 hours. So it increased its viability. You're growing yeast, right?
Right.
Interestingly enough, the highest 3 from 30 Plato to 38 Plato, it went from 7 down to 2 viable cells.
That's crazy. So what we're basically what that's saying is you throw these yeast into a less hospitable environment, a very, very high wort or high OG wort. And rather than getting to work like they do in we'll just say a sub 1060 OG ish wort, they actually stall. I mean, it sounds like they lose viability. They lose the ability to do what we want them to do.
Exactly. So, I mean, we hear this, I think the best, maybe something more common things people hear is, oh, you got liquid yeast, okay, do this, this, and this. If you have dry yeast, you better rehydrate that stuff in water, or you're going to lose half your cells. Right. And it's another way of what's going on. Those cells just can't take it as well, even in the case of dry yeast in any environment. But looking at the liquid yeast, even it's going to take a hit.
So it's so fascinating to me that on some level, the fact that it kind of jibes with what we've all been told, and this research that you're talking about, sort of confirms that. It's just the fact that they were able to test out, tossing in yeast, and they're like measurably, objectively losing viability is really interesting to me. Now, obviously, I think for most of our listeners and as brewers, what we're most concerned with is the manifestation of those issues. How does that manifest? What might we expect? If I go and I take this nice healthy pitch of yeast and I throw it into a beer and it loses that viability, how might we expect to taste that or to smell that?
Yeah, so at any fermentation, if it's with rougher yeast, what's going to change? The yeast, we said, it has so much of a flavor impact. Stress on yeast is going to cause changes in esters. It's going to probably increase the esters that are going to form in the beer. Along with, it's going to be harder to reabsorb some byproducts. The yeast, when it's fermenting, it's going to make diacetyl. It's going to make acetaldehyde. You're going to risk leaving those compounds in the beer and maybe not reabsorbing them. So if you've had issues with getting the diacetyl out of a beer or getting the acetaldehyde out of a finished beer, that's going to be a risk.
Right, because those yeast, basically everything that those yeast would typically do, they're not going to be able to do as well if you're pitching it into a high OG wort. So now to kind of flip this around, you've got this yeast that is you pitched into a stressful environment, and if you do it right and you care for it, maybe you add some nutrient, we know that you can make a good beer by a good high OG beer. We've all done it.
Absolutely. So then now that yeast is done, it might be a little beaten up, and it's not to say that it's worthless yeast at the end, but it's just got some stress on it, and you have to remember that.
I like the idea of worthless yeast though. Like these yeast need some therapy or something.
Yeah. So we want to, like any high gravity fermentation, you want to take care of it. We talked about sterols. That's adding oxygen. The recommended amount of oxygen is 10 ppm of oxygen. Really, the only way to get that is with pure oxygen and a stone for the oxygen initially. It's even recommended these days to probably hit it with another hit of oxygen about 12 hours after pitching, because they're going to go through, like we said earlier, a lag phase where they're absorbing oxygen. They're going to have a bunch of oxygen and they're about to start fermenting.
Yeah.
Getting them another hit is going to just make them multiply better. And then at the end, if we care about viability of the yeast, it fermented well. Well, now we're having much more viable yeast at the end. I think that also is a good point to bring in on what is viable and what is vital yeast.
Yeah.
I think this is one that people talk about yeast cell counts. We mentioned microscopes earlier. What is viability and what is vitality? Viable means something is alive. I mean, the word viable, it can function.
Yeah.
Vital is, are you healthy? That is a subset of viability. How many people measure viable yeast is with something called a methylene blue stain. You take your yeast, you actually dilute it down to some number of yeast cells so that you can see it in a microscope, and then they have it's a heptocytometer. It's a little grid where all your yeast will float on, and then you can count them with a piece of paper and a microscope and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's their cell count.
Yeah, that's viability, right? Cell count. When we talk about viability, we're talking about how many healthy cells there are there.
Yeah. And what you can do is when you can stain them, and they'll take up or not take up this dye. And if they're taking up the dye, it means their cell walls are permeable. So it's a sign that they might not be ready to go as much as you can.
Right.
This is not vital. And actually, if you read all the books about viability with cell counts, they say if your stain test doesn't pass 80%, as in if you had 100 cells and you think 20 are dying, that is not good yeast. That's what they'll just say straight up. Like, you can't understand what they're doing below that.
Yeah.
Because you're not measuring vitality, you're measuring viability.
So when it comes to repitching yeast from a high OG beer, then we have to consider how viable is that yeast. I mean, it just worked its tail off to ferment this huge beer. Presumably, it worked. Especially if that big old 1100 OG beer dropped down to the expected FG, then I can see how you might presume, hey, that yeast is still kicking and ready to go. It did its job well. I'm going to take some and repitch it. The problem is, it may be that was that yeast was like rip roaring ready to go, and it kind of wants to take a break now, right? I mean,
I think the main thing there is it's going to be, if we look at what we've said so far, so we're probably going to lose some cells along the way. This is it's tough on the yeast, so you might expect in your cell counts, I'm going to just assume less viable yeast, even if the cell count is the same, even if I'm getting the same amount of matter. Let's just assume it's only 80% or something. And in professional brewing, they're probably going to say, I'm not going to go for that. Home brewing, why not? I mean, if you do it and it works, that's the main thing. How do you think of the flavors afterwards?
Right.
That's part of it, but you have to keep in mind how viable and there's the stress components. I didn't get into this yet, but how the yeast cells they change over time, and if you're going to put them through that pressure of the sugar pressure and stuff, how much more can they take? Just because even if they're alive, they're going to change their properties and change the beer's properties in the end.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we didn't hit on that I guess probably my biggest concern when it came to repitching yeast, particularly from a higher OG beer, is the potential for autolysis off flavors. And to me, when I think at least that I've experienced autolysis, I get more of like a burnt rubber kind of a smoky thing that just really shouldn't be there. Well, as someone who for years adamantly refused to do this, to repitch yeast from a higher OG batch of beer into a lower OG wort, I was pretty excited to finally test it out for myself. Results when we're back from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Without question, my beliefs about yeast health, particularly as it relates to reusing yeast that previously fermented another beer, were largely built on the words of those I viewed as brewing authorities. The Yeast book, Chris White, Jamil Zainasheff, I put a lot into what they were saying, and I was absolutely convinced that repitching yeast from a big beer would result in predictable or perceptible issues. The thing is, it was never really an issue for me because I rarely make high OG styles, so my opportunity to test this variable out finally came when I did keg a batch of barley wine. In fact, I made a short and shoddy barley wine that you can go read about, and this yeast cake is sitting there. It was nice and clean. I was like, what can I do with that? And I got the idea to test this out. So this was a couple years ago. Now, a little bit of info about this barley wine before we get into the experiment. It was 1099 OG, so a pretty big one. And I fermented it with Imperial Yeast AO7 Flagship. That's their version of the Chico strain. I kegged it in March of 2018, collected 400 milliliters of slurry. I did not rinse it. It was just a nice big slug of slurry that I pulled from the bottom of the fermentation vessel. And I used a calculator to determine that was approximately 200 billion cells. Now, there's a lot of people out there who contested this and said that it was probably triple that amount. To be honest, this was one of those ones where I was thinking, what's the normal thing a homebrewer would do? And maybe it wasn't as controlled as it could have been. But anyways, that was based on my calculations, about 200 billion cells when you accounted for all of the trub and other stuff that was in there. The slurry was then stored in my fridge for about a week before being used. And I did not prop it up in a starter, though I did make a Vitality starter. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, on to the experiment. So I made a single 10-gallon batch of a very simple blonde ale. I think my reason for choosing this is obvious. I just wanted every other flavor to get out of the way.
You also just don't like making bigger beers, so why not have a smaller beer around?
Exactly. That's my MO, right? But I really didn't want like a hoppy beer. I didn't want anything, a really characterful yeast or anything to get in the way of the impact of repitching the yeast from a bigger beer. So I mashed this beer mashed at 150 degrees Fahrenheit at 67 C for 60 minutes. I boiled for 30 minutes because I'm crazy like that. During the boil, I added 7 grams of Centennial at a first wort hop, 7 grams of Simcoe at 20 minutes, 7 grams each of Centennial and Simcoe at 10 minutes, and then 4 grams each of both of those same hops at 5 minutes left in the boil. After the boil, I chilled the wort down, and then I took a refractometer reading. The wort was at 1048 OG. So we're repitching a 1099 OG slug of yeast into a 1048 OG wort. I've gotten to the point where I'm not necessarily scared to do these things anymore, but I have to be honest. I'm sitting here going, what am I doing this for?
Well, that's the best part of this process is that, you're going to write the experiment and run it, and then we're going to find out what happened. So it's the fear shouldn't, you have to subside that fear a little bit. Just go for it.
Yeah, I've embraced the potential of having to dump a batch. I'm no longer worried about doing that anymore. So
me too.
Yeah. So after the boil, I split that wort equally between a couple of sanitized brew buckets. And those were placed in my fermentation chamber to finish chilling to my desired fermentation temperature of 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C. During that time, I stole some remnant wort and I made 2 equal-sized vitality starters. One of them got a fresh pouch of Imperial AO7 flagship, and the other one I just pitched that whole slug of yeast from the mason jar into that one, and I let them sit for 4 hours before returning and throwing those into the beers. Let's see here. I raised the temperature after about 4 days of fermentation. I raised the temperature to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 C. I will say this, both beers were fermenting very actively the next morning, but that one that got the high OG ale yeast was going bonkers. I mean, it just,
really?
Yeah, oh God, yeah. There was no doubt in my mind that viability wasn't the issue necessarily, but it could have been that if it was an overpitch, just that there was so much because of the overpitch, maybe whether they were healthy or not, right?
Yeah, I think you probably got less lag phase. It was like, what, I got enough cells, I'm going to go for it, kind of thing.
There was very little lag in that one. I mean, when I went back, you know how it is as a home brewer. You go and you check your beer 2 hours after you make it.
Hey, I saw a bubble. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. Woohoo! It worked. It's like magic. But this one it took off right away. I mean, there was very, very little lag, and it just zipped right through fermentation. I think at the 4-day mark, that one was done fermenting, and the fresh yeast one was still just like you'd expect, kind of gently bubbling. So I did ramp up the temperature, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 C, let it sit for another 3 days, and then took hydrometer measurements showing that both attenuated to the same 1007 FG. Not surprising, but I do think it's an interesting finding because of the fact there's a lot of people out there who will claim that by pitching a lot of yeast, you can drive attenuation further down. This just goes to show, in my opinion, or it supports the idea that a yeast kind of has its window within which it will attenuate,
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting stuff. I want to pull up one thing. Many, a few years ago, there wasn't as many podcasts or blogs, but I did find this one website I'd read many times. It's called the Science Brewer, or Brew Science, excuse me.
Oh, yeah.
Brew Science. Jason Rodriguez did a test in 2012. He took 3 different pitch rates, 0.75 million cells per milliliter wort Play-Doh, underpitched, that was the controlled pitch rate, underpitched 0.1 million cells, so very underpitched, and then overpitched. He did this with Yeast 1056 and then published the results. The controlled pitch finished, it was in the 1050s was the initial beer. The controlled pitch finished at 1013. Okay, sounds about right.
Standard, right?
Interesting. Underpitch and overpitch both finished at 10009.
Huh.
Right? So this is like, what's going on here? So he contacted Garrett Oliver from Brooklyn Brewing, and this is what Garrett said. I'm just going to read this verbatim. He said, "It's my suspicion that the overpitch achieved a lower gravity as expected because the high numbers of cells available to work. The underpitch, however, eventually had a higher percentage of cells of daughter cells versus older cells. The daughter cells have near 100% viability, high sterile levels, and are raring to go, while older cells will have various viabilities, membrane condition, etc. Many of them may not be ready for active fermentation as the daughters. I expect, therefore, the underpitch to have a slower start and the overpitch then the overpitch or the control, but then catch up pretty suddenly and attenuate well. Of course, all of this assumes good yeast."
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting because in essence, if what he's saying, again, he admits that he's just kind of presuming a lot of this, but if what he's saying is true, then it's not, the underpitch doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to create a beer that's under attenuated, but the stress that it has to go through to propagate during that fermentation may very well, impart the beer with some off flavors or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And we said earlier, the more yeast growth is tied to flavor. So if you're having to put this yeast through the ringer, get ready for some interesting flavors.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah. Well. So the fact is, these two. Now we know that Imperial Yeast is very, very healthy. The patch that I pitched was very healthy. I mean, it was fresh. So it could just be that again, both of these were maybe slightly overpitched because it was only a 1048 OG wort. So
sure.
Maybe that helps to explain at least why they finished at the same 1007 FG. At that point, the beers were cold crashed and fined with gelatin before I transferred them to kegs, burst carbonated them, and then I left them in the Keezer for about a week of conditioning. Now, first things first, how did these beers look? Well, the one fermented with fresh yeast was noticeably more clear than the one fermented with harvested yeast.
Interesting.
I thought that was, I thought it was fascinating. The only thing that I kind of came up with was as to why the, high OG yeast beer was hazier, and it was noticeably hazier. I mean, you can go look at the experiment
I saw
article.
those pictures. It's markedly different.
It's markedly different. And what I don't get is what would cause that. Was there stuff in the trube of the yeast cake from the high OG slurry that I took that maybe, stayed in solution? Both of them got hit with gelatin. So it doesn't make sense to me why that one didn't clear up the way the other one did.
Yeah. And I was trying to figure this out. And honestly, I think the jury's out on this for as a scientific reason. In general, clarification and flocculation, yeast are going to control this, but also, like you said, what you added from the previous beer, proteins, anything like that. And so, I think I'm in your camp. I mean, there's two places. It's what carried on through, and then I also kind of think the yeast morphology is going to control flocculation and what kind of things are going to pick up on the yeast cell and drop out.
Yeah,
and so that is, I think, another place I would imagine is where we're talking about.
To me, this was the first sign that perhaps the yeast that was pitched wasn't as healthy as it could have been. Because I do kind of associate a yeast natural ability to get in, do its job, and get out of the way with yeast health. So perhaps this was a first sign of that. Now, I ended up doing 8 semi-blind triangle tests myself. Out of those 8, I was able to identify the odd beer out 6 times. Not perfect, but that's pretty damn close. Very, very consistent. For me, the aroma immediately gave it away. Now, obviously, two of my attempts, I didn't get it. So it's not like they were completely different. Yeah. But there was something in the aroma. The fresh yeast beer smelled great. It smelled like a nice, malty, toasty blonde ale that I've made numerous times. Basically what I expected as I was designing that beer. The beer fermented with yeast harvested from the barley wine had this subtle but noticeable and that rubbery thing. And it was so displeasing to me. But it's weird though, because it's tough for me to explain what this is. It is the same characteristic that I picked up. If you guys recall, when I talked about the high trube lager that I made a few years ago, and we did a show on it recently, actually, that same character. So it's something in that harvested yeast. And I have to think that it may be something related to the trube, but it seems to impart, I think the word I used back then was flubber. I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like silly putty, that smell of silly putty. And
it's like just artificial kind of chemically new car smell kind of thing. Yeah,
with a rubber bent on it. It's so weird. And I don't like it. But the question is, did participants taste a difference? So I served this one to 21 people, out of which 12 would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that this was a significant experiment. And 12 is exactly the number that did. So for this one, we could say that tasters reliably were able, to distinguish these beers. 12 out of 21, that's 57%. May not sound like a lot, but in terms of a triangle test, that is a significant finding. I was surprised more people didn't get it, to be honest. But also, I was so, I knew about this beer so well. I'd been sampling them from the FG samples, basically. The fact that it was significant, though, we did go and ask those who did get it correct to pick the one that they liked the most. 7 actually said that they preferred the fresh yeast beer. I'm with those people. 4 people of those 12 said that they liked the yeast slurry beer better, which just blows my mind. I mean, there's something about, if that doesn't speak to the subjectivity of preference, right?
Well, I think there's you say rubbery, and then, all we can do as beer, let's say judges or beer appreciators, is how we interpret those things. Rubbery to you might be nothing to someone else, or it might be alarm bells to someone else. So, there's this necessarily like what's your preference and how you're interpreting those flavors. And so if you weren't getting it, you just like the beer, then there you go.
Yeah. No, hey, you know what? Those 4 people, you could drink the whole keg if you want. You have it because I don't want it. One person did report perceiving no difference. That's just the nature of statistics. Is some people guessed correctly. So, all right. And so this was a significant finding. We can say with some degree of confidence, I guess, that what we've been told about reusing yeast that previously fermented a high OG beer is probably fairly accurate. I'm not going to be with certainty. I will not be repitching yeast from a high OG beer into a lower OG batch of wort.
Yeah, I think I can be certain because I doubt you're going to be brewing many high OG beers anytime soon. So
that's right.
Your supply will limit your ability.
Yeah, the only reason I'm not doing it, right?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the best practice is likely to reuse, if you're going to reuse yeast at the very least. First off, just prop it up in a starter and split it off. That's probably the easiest way to get clean yeast. But if you are going to pull yeast from a batch, maybe do this. If you're going to go iterative steps, maybe start with a lower OG, pitch that into a higher OG and build it up that way. Maybe not go the opposite direction. Again, kind of common wisdom these days.
Yeah. And I think those are, I think the first time people think about reusing yeast it could be the money aspect. It could be the availability aspect. Maybe you can't find the yeast you want.
Oh yeah.
But another one is, hey, I made I want to make a barley wine. I want to make a stout. I need the yeast. I don't want to go buy 6 packs of yeast.
Right.
Okay. I'll just make a smaller beer and then reuse that yeast.
Exactly.
And that's, the first way anyone really tries this, I think.
That was actually how I developed the website's most popular recipe, Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. I was making a double IPA. God, this was years ago now. And I just picked up some yeast and I didn't feel like buying, 3 or 4 vials of it. And so I made Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, this small, 1048 to 1050 OG pale ale that ended up being way better than the double IPA afterwards. All right, we've got some reader comments we're going to get to. First off, Michael Benedetti asked what exactly I meant when I said the beers were way more alike than they were different. By that, I just mean, if you look at my triangle test, results, I got 6 out of 8 right. If they were very, very different, then I would have gotten 8 out of 8 right. The fact is they tasted like the same beer. It's just that one of them had this subtle, that subtle rubbery thing. So to me, I'd say they were like 90% the same. There's just that 10% difference, which was noticeable enough for the experiment to be significant. So that's all I meant by that. Next comment comes from MN Wayne. I think he's probably from Minnesota. He says, perhaps I'm missing something here. I just don't understand what the attraction is to reusing yeast. Is there some sort of adaptation that results in better performance or overwhelming time savings? Initially, I overbuilt a starter, saving a pint. The evening before brew day, I'd warm it up and prepare a starter, stabilize the temps, and put it on the stir plate. Morning comes, I've got plenty of action. When the wort cools, I pitch, keeping a pint of the starter for the next batch. Next morning, I've got a party going on in the fermenter and a clean strain in the fridge for the next batch. What advantage am I missing out on in reusing old yeast from a prior batch?
I think we kind of summarized it here. There's a lot of opportunities. The first one, like I said, is, hey, I want to make a bigger beer. I'm just going to propagate this yeast here and use that.
Yeah.
Another one is, it was a bigger deal years ago when some yeast companies would only release a strain once a year.
Yeah.
You couldn't get it anytime else. Or now it's these vault strains or, exclusive strains. Where else am I going to get it? So I might as well just keep using this yeast.
Yeah.
He is right. It's going to change over time. Let's be clear. It's going to change. And if you like that change, more power to you. If you don't, well, then go get a fresh pitch.
Yeah. And I feel like what Wayne might be asking here is, why wouldn't you just propagate in starters and do the clean yeast thing? Why are people, I guess, always going and repitching from a prior batch? I don't know, man. I feel like a lot of us, you make a batch and you're like, hey, there's all of this fresh yeast there. May as well use it,
Yeah.
I actually don't know many people, many homebrewers who are constantly taking, slurry from a beer and repitching that these days. It doesn't seem like it's that common.
It's not that common. I think it's just an option.
Yeah.
It's an option. And I think, if you want to keep the consistency, like what I call the master copy consistency is using starters, right?
Yeah.
The same starters all the time.
Yeah. Well, and I do think on the commercial scale, you hear the cone to cone or, repitching from prior batches is probably a bit more common. Again, yeast is the most expensive ingredient in brewing beer. And that's probably, I have to imagine, what drives a lot of the motivation for reusing yeast from a prior batch. So.
And then any time you're talking about a business, it's money and time and dollars.
100%.
And if they're going to have it, if it's easier for them to grab a couple slugs, throw it in the next beer, and off you go, then that's bonus. That's huge.
Yeah, for sure. Next comment comes from Christopher Taylor. He says, I've tended towards overbuilding my starters, but have used slurries in the past and even just racked my wort onto an old yeast cake too. I considered the Belgian practice of reusing their yeast for years and thought the idea of yeast getting, quote, tired or producing off flavors was bunk. Now I'll have to reconsider that.
Absolutely. We like I said, anthropomorphizing yeast is useful for a lot of reasons. You don't want to go too far down that road, but yeah, the Belgian brewers and a lot of other cultural brewing, how they propagate and how they use stuff becomes a part of just the brewing practice. Home brewers are used to buying the yeast from a yeast company, using it once or twice, and that's it. It's different behaviors and different things are all linked together into this selective pressure.
Yeah.
So, you have a statistical significance that you can tell the difference, but some people liked it. Some people did. Some people preferred the other one. So it goes all the way back down to it worked. There was a difference, but what you taste or what you want to taste is what you want to go for.
Yeah. God, couldn't agree more with that. And again, I'm not going to say I'm not a big advice giver. I don't like to give advice. Will I be repitching from a higher OG beer? No, I won't. I just won't do that anymore. One, I don't make those beers very often, as we've pointed out. But two, it just seems like a poor practice for what I prefer. If people are out there doing it and they're making beers they like, then who cares? Let them do it. I'm not here to stop you from doing that. Yeah. So, all right. Now, I got another comment here. Reddit user Yono1986. He says, even though there was a detectable difference here, I feel like not reusing high OG slurry is far more important in the industry, I think he means the professional industry here, than in homebrewing. In a 100 barrel conical, there's going to be about 10.5 metric tons of liquid weight sitting on top of the yeast, which increases stress. Also, if a homebrew batch comes out with some slight off flavors, you might not be happy, but you commit to doing better next time and life goes on. In a commercial brewery, that slight off flavor is a huge deal. First of all, you need to have batch to batch consistency in a commercial context. Secondly, failed batches are ungodly expensive. Not only are you out on malt and hops that you can't use, but you're also out on the labor and the opportunity cost of having a fermenter tied up for however many days when it could have been spending that time fermenting sellable beer. Amen, Yono 1986.
100% there. He nailed it right there. A lot of these things, home brewing has been existing for a long time. Commercial brewing, we have data now, we have papers. They can't take risks like we can take risks. And a bad batch, like he said, a big fermenter full of beer, and there's something wrong, then we're not doing that. So they're just being statistically careful and saying, let's not do this with this batch today.
Yeah. And we've been around the brewing scene long enough to where we have a lot of friends in the industry. Andy, I'm sure that's the same for you. They love homebrewers because we do take risks. I mean, if I had, and I'm not going to use the old, if I had a nickel saying here, but I get emails from people don't want to believe it, from professional brewers all the time, suggesting experiments for us to try out, thanking us for doing certain things so that they didn't have to, I mean, that is what is so cool about being a home brewer, is that they really do. It seems like commercial breweries really do, particularly probably smaller craft breweries, but appreciate the fact that we're so experimental and do these crazy things that they don't have to do. So,
especially for the smaller breweries, we look a lot more like them.
Exactly.
We don't look like Anheuser-Busch or anyone that has huge facilities that have to really be careful. These guys then take hey, have you used Kavik yet? What did you think of that? I want to try. I want to play with that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, firm temp, all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah.
All right, final comment comes from Reddit user WallaWalla22. I don't religiously read your material, but anytime I do, I end up clicking on 5 to 20 related articles and reading for 1 to 2 hours on end, almost without fail. Thank you for the quality.
That is like a Wikipedia black hole type
exactly.
Stuff.
I know. I do the same thing. That's the only reason I do that, and I love the fact that we've built this thing that is basically like brewing Wikipedia thing where you just get lost, clicking things and reading the results. So WallaWalla22, I appreciate the comment.
That's awesome.
Well, Andy, I think we've about covered everything in terms of reusing yeast slurry from a high OG batch of beer. How you feeling about your first show, man?
Hey, I got it done. That's all. That's what counts.
I think you did a good job. If our listeners want to let us know, just be nice. He's new, guys, right?
Yeah. Give me time. Give me time.
Yeah, no, you're awesome, man. And I had a good time talking about this. I think it's a fascinating topic. Again, doesn't seem like a lot of people are doing it these days. I'm certainly not going to be doing it. But if you are out there and maybe you are repitching from bigger, higher OG beer, I know a lot of homebrewers love to make high OG beers, and you're getting a weird off flavor. Maybe consider pitching, upwards as opposed to downwards. All right, don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no